Okay, so we can just transition to the panel. So I'll introduce our discussant, Sera Linardi. Sera Linardi is a professor of economics at the University of Pittsburgh. She's also an executive committee member of this conference series and someone whose work in economics, computer science, and social work has been deeply inspiring to many of us. And I'll hand over the mic to Sera, who will kick us off with this panel.
Hey, thanks, Fred, for that very nice introduction. So let me just introduce our speakers. So Trooper is the CEO of Benefits Data Trust and opening up access for benefits to millions of people. And Ellora is an assistant professor of economics at Princeton. And she just spoke about a case of why we should talk about history for when we think about economic policy and the persistence of the black-white gap. All right. So I'm going to try to ask questions that kind of, bring both of your talks together, and then, also be open to the audience for questions. So Ellora, you talked about the need to, talk about history for economic policy, and Trooper, you talked about the fact that before quantitative researchers came into this field, there was already a lot of research being done that has affected policy, it has affected conversations, right? So if we bring these two things together, some of the policies that Ellora talks about, like the 1930s, the 1960s, those were probably affected more by qualitative research that formed the conversation. And then now, as we're moving more towards quantitative research, how do you both see this affecting future policymaking?
Ellora, do you want to start?
Sure, I can jump in and then hand it off to you. It's a really fascinating and excellent question to kick off with. As we were working on this question of minimum wage policy in the 1960s, we wanted to get a sense of whether policymakers at the time anticipated what the impact of the law would be, especially on racial economic disparities, and on, say, employment, et cetera. So we found an incredible statement by President Lyndon Johnson as he signed the expansions of the minimum wage into law. He said, "We know that this will uplift the most vulnerable in our society and that it won't have, disproportionate effects on job loss." And it's a kind of incredible statement. There really wasn't any empirical evidence that would stand up to our standards today at the time to support this. And so my co-author and I use this as motivation, like, well, let's test that question. It was, the debates on employment effects of the minimum wage have been raging for basically as long as the minimum wage has existed as a policy. But we've had, I would say, an empirical or a credibility revolution in economics, where we actually started using very precise research designs to ask the counterfactual, well, in the absence of this policy, what would jobs look like? Or we can really compare places that, as if randomly, get the minimum wage versus not. And those designs have really shifted the conversation, because time and time again, we saw that actually the employment effects of minimum wages were very, very minimal in much of the recent evidence.
Thank you. Trooper, just real quick, Irene is reminding me that there's live translation going on. So if we all speak slower, it would really help the translator. Thanks, Irene. Go ahead, Trooper.
So I think the Lyndon Johnson example is a great, in that there's a push-pull, I believe, with the quantitative, in that, frankly, policymakers and at the kind of political level, when you're talking about laws and sort of grand sweeps of policy, work in stories, because that moves power. And so in some cases, even if there's a vacuum of data and there's a vacuum of quantitative knowledge, that policy and political leaders will fill it in with whatever they're saying. And so it's important to be part of that debate, to bring the quantitative in. On the other side, there are, I think for some who are probably more entrepreneurial in the policy sense, I think probably on the Democratic on the Democratic side, there's Senator Warren. There's a late senator, Senator Tom Coburn, when I was in government. Even if I personally may not have disagreed with what he was saying, he would always find data-driven arguments around things. And even if I disagreed with it, I knew I needed to slow down and make sure I understood it because of how he used quantitative research and analysis. And so, I think it's figuring out it. One, I think for quantitative folks, it's doing what you do best and sticking to your rigor and your credibility. But then I think it's building the relationships with others so that what you do can be incorporated into the broader efforts.
So what I'm hearing is the stories still move the policy making, but the data provides evidence that doesn't allow stories that maybe have no generalizability to push too far, right? And give some backing between the stories that are a representation of a more universal experience to gain more traction. So very nice. Okay, so here's another question. So we talked about, Ellora talks about the wealth accumulating conditions, right? And we know what one of the things that Trooper does is benefit access, right? So how far does access to benefits, making social programs easier to access, make wealth accumulation conditions more similar?
Ooh, so that's interesting. So the broad question, wow, that would be a research question I would love to dig into to be able to make the case. But here's what we do know. We know that programs such as WIC, child nutrition program targeting mothers, and SNAP or food stamps, can have a material difference on children's development and learning outcomes. And you can sort of take from there the potential, or at least providing the foundation for broader economic mobility and achievement. On the other side, if we think about broader equity questions, one study we did do was an RCT that looked at SNAP's or food stamps impact on seniors. And it showed that it could delay when a senior would go into a nursing home. So the time they can live at home. Now, if you think about the pandemic and nursing homes and care centers being an epicenter of fatalities, if you think about the enormous financial strain that having a loved one in a nursing home can place on a family, to think that investing in a better bag of groceries for seniors could have not only saved lives during the pandemic, but frankly also saved our healthcare system dollars and saved families dollars because of that could have gone to other issues to advance economic stakes is pretty significant.
Yeah, Trooper makes some excellent points there, and the example about benefits that extend life. I mean, what could be more powerful for that? That does directly translate into wealth accumulation and transmission across generations, because wealth accumulates over the life cycle. So when you think about the moment of transmitting to the next generation, the mortality gap itself between low income and high income families, between Black and white Americans, that itself can contribute to these accumulated wealth differentials. I think so. It's very clear that social safety net policies that improve economic mobility, they're going to translate into faster income convergence across generations if kids can equalize in terms of their education outcomes. All of those things help with convergence. But another angle to think about is the universality of these programs. So when we have programs that have, say, asset tests, means tested programs, they apply extremely high marginal tax rates at the bottom and can even dissuade, wealth accumulation, right? So that you don't lose access to your benefits. So the design of these policies can also have perverse effects potentially, and those are things that we want to pay attention to as well.
Okay, very, 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 very important points. So I think something from Trooper is it's the cumulative effects of shocks that benefits cushion you from, right? Like we don't think about the fact that someone not getting their grocery for this week will then result in this humongous shock that end them in nursing home that then causes financial ruin. And then Ellora's point of these benefits are great, and these benefits are important, but the way they're administered right now with their rigorous asset tests may discourage wealth accumulation, right? So yeah, and I'm also thinking about minimum wage, right? Like if the minimum wage is raised without some of this test being changed, then you could have some unintended consequences. So I think this is a good time also to answer two of the questions that is in our Q&A. I can see them kind of interacting within this minimum wage public benefits area that we're talking about. So one question is, do you think the absence of a public health system could have a similar effect to the lack of minimum wage policy in keeping the gaps in place?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. So what we know from the version of public health that we have in the United States today, which is basically Medicaid and Medicare, is that the introduction of these programs and expansions in these programs have reduced racial health disparities. So once again, I would tie that back to the mortality question and just how important the length of your life is for wealth building and for then having more to pass on to the next generation. And in addition to the end of life effects or mortality effects, there's also just productivity effects, your ability to work. Extending your working years is also a way to build wealth. So I think absolutely it'd be really great to have maybe a longer time frame view of these questions and see just how much of an effect, say, the introduction of Medicaid and Medicare, these are 1960s Great Society programs, have had on these differentials.
No, it's a very interesting question. Some work we are doing right now is connecting what is the impact on health outcomes and health utilization. So the cash that we have to put towards healthcare, if we take not only Medicaid, but then bundle SNAP and other benefits as the social drivers of health, and what impact can that have? And I think when we talk about equity, there's certainly just the sheer question of health equity and how that can be addressed. But if we think about the wealth gap and economic mobility, one, the hard truth is that in this economy, more of us are going to need to work longer and to have the health and wellness ability to be in the labor force longer. And so, improving those health outcomes so that 60s, 70s, into 80s, you're able to still participate in the labor force. Two, I think it's looking at the intergenerational supports that are needed to advance economic mobility. And so, I frankly, one of my side hustles is I'm on the national board of Girl Scouts, and we are laser focused on how can we, yes, I am man enough to be a Girl Scout and proud of it. But one of the things that we are really interested in is girls and STEM, and girls, millions of girls to frankly be like all of you out there at this conference, and an intergenerational support, particularly in working class and families where parents may have to stretch and to do what they need to do to earn a living. Keeping the grandparents engaged and healthy can make a really big difference as a booster for economic mobility.
Wonderful points. There's another question here in the chat that is, I think for Ellora. It says, Andre Grauer asks, do we have a sense of what the impact of reducing the wealth gap would be if the minimum wage was raised today? Would it some way compare to the 1967 period?
This is a fantastic question, and I think there's kind of a two-part response. So certainly one thing that we have seen, in addition to wealth convergence stagnating, income convergence between Black and white Americans has also stagnated. And you kind of saw that in one of the figures I showed, over the past 40 years, again, the income gap has been very stable. So absolutely, we think that if we could spur or encourage income convergence to resume, and we think that, say, raising the federal minimum wage, again, it would have a disproportionate benefit for Black Americans. Both groups would, of course, see increases in wages, but because Black Americans are, again, concentrated at the lower part of the wage distribution, they're going to benefit disproportionately. So yes, this can help, regenerate some income convergence. At the same time, when we look at the sources of actually a widening in the wealth gap today, a big factor is rising wealth inequality. It's the fact that you have stock equity taking off and virtually no Black Americans invested in it, while if you look at the top 10% of the wealth distribution who are seeing such huge gains, it's a virtually all white group. So what we learned is that, you can do what you can with growth of income, but if you don't address this kind of skyrocketing wealth at the top, we're still going to see a widening of the wealth gap. So we kind of need a bundle of policies that are sort of attacking things from different angles. Of course, none of those policies, can boost income growth, you can tax wealth and drive that, queue down for the most wealthy. They're still just gonna, determine whether we continue converging or keep diverging. They're not really going to address the enormous magnitude of the wealth gap. And that's why, we really have to think about other kinds of policies. Reparations is one that kind of tries to address the starting points, is how we got to the levels we have today.
So I want to follow up on that that observation that the stocks, is what's driving a lot of the growth right now. But like there is a racial gap in using that as an asset accumulation engine. For Trooper, do you also see a similar thing in benefits? Are certain kinds of benefits being more welcome, according to racial groups than others? And if so, why do you think that is? And Ellora, like, why do you think what is behind this distrust of stocks?
So it's a really interesting question. I mean, one, I think there's much more research that we need to do around racial and ethnic implications and angles around this. But I think we do see a few things. I think one, there can be complexity in benefits access when in communities where there may be more multi-generational households, and you just have more things to sort through, and income and assets and other things that my amazing colleagues do, but can be a deterrent for people to even like engage with this with the system and ask the questions. I think from a benefits point of view. And really seeing, the bundle of benefits that someone can have that can significantly increase their what they're able to spend as an asset, frankly. And that's a shift in our social attitudes. I mentioned earlier that we talk to people all the time who were afraid to call, who were ashamed to call, who felt it was taking something from someone else. And I don't think there is a person in the United States, as I mentioned earlier. I mean, I own a home. I take the home mortgage deduction. It is pure welfare for the better off. It is complete. It is a welfare check from the IRS. There is no one who takes the home mortgage deduction who's ashamed of it. In fact, we brag about it. And so I think part of changing the conversation around these programs is really saying, like, look, this is what you need. Sometimes you pay in, sometimes you pull out. It all kind of works out. Is an important part of using the benefit system to meet immediate needs, and it can be capital to advance equity.
Oh, that's really powerful. And yeah, I mean, shifting those kinds of norms might take a generation of universal benefits, and then it stops feeling like a handout because it's there for everyone. On this very important question about why might there be differences in portfolio composition and how do we address that, I just wanted to note that when we look at portfolio composition by racial group, we do see that Black Americans hold much less stock equity than white Americans. At the same time, if we were to remove the top 10% of the wealth distribution and look at that composition again, we don't see any differentials. So really, the way to think about it is that there's a slice at the top where basically homogenous. There's not much diversity there. It's an all-white group essentially who are just making these huge gains from rising stock prices and just the appreciation we've seen there over the last 30, 40 years. So of course, there's plenty of reasons you might think that the Black community would not have full trust in the financial system. There's the failure of the Freedmen's Bank, right, which lost many of the savings of the newly emancipated. They put their money in the Freedmen's Bank, it gambled, it failed. And just kind of some of the estimates are like 50% of freed person wealth was lost at that time. And you have other examples like the Tulsa race massacre, where Black wealth was just literally destroyed. And so we actually do have some evidence that this changes behavior, and some of the behavior that it changes has to do with home ownership, where people might buy homes, where you feel safe, like you won't, wake up to a firebomb or a burning cross, things like that. So yeah, as a society, we need to kind of actively address these triggers of terror and the mistrust that they then generate, that actually passes across generations as well.
Wow, this is really good conversation between, so what I'm hearing is there's many things, right? So Ellora is pointing out the history, and I think we do hear a lot about this, right? Like the kinds of past harms that that people have experienced that now reduces their willingness to adopt certain kinds of asset possibility, financial instruments. And then I think Trooper's point on multi-generational household, just sort of culturally how a household is composed, that's a really good point. I never thought about that, right? If you think about the SNAP benefit form, it has 9 pages, and then you have to list every single family member and what their assets are. If you have 9 family members, that is 9 times harder than if you have 1, right? So I would be okay, it's not worth it. So that's a really good point, that cultural household composition interacts with the access in ways we probably are not familiar with unless we are in that lived experience. So I mean, another one is the distinction between an experience of an ethnic group versus a socioeconomic experience, like what Ellora was saying. The use of more risky financial asset is higher among the highest asset group, right? So it's it really doesn't matter what race you are. If you weren't that group, you were just not comfortable with them. So really great points. I'm gonna go back to our Q&A panel here, and then there's a question from an attendee. Are there metrics other than the wealth gap ratio of white wealth and Black wealth that you have looked at or think are important to pay attention to?
Yeah, I can start, but I think there's so many potential answers to that, of course. So, one, full disclosure, when I talk about the average wealth gap, which is what I presented on, that's one type of measure. And even among wealth, we have different measures. For example, the median wealth gap, that is actually larger. It's 10 to 1. So in other words, ignoring the top, you might say, oh, all of racial wealth inequality is just driven by the top. No, actually gaps are larger as you go down the income distribution, which suggests, it's something more than, on average, Black people have lower income and therefore they have lower wealth. In fact, the median Black household does not own a home. So these are kind of some of the very striking facts we learn when we look at different measures, even of wealth. But other gaps that we might care about, for example, I think a very powerful one is differences in upward mobility. So we can think about, starting off from the same level of parent income, how do kids do once they grow up? And there are tremendous racial differences in this. And there's a lot of work that looks at this. Some of my own work looking at the Great Migration and the backlash it generated. I found that, these places like Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, that used to be part of this promised land, meaning if you could get there, if you could get your kids there, they would have a different life than they would growing up in the Jim Crow South. Well, the backlash took that ladder away. So now you see that some of the gaps in upward mobility, 2 kids coming from same levels of parent income are going to do worse because that ladder was removed. So these differentials by race, for example.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. On the benefit side, I think yes, just the pure cash and what that does is important. But I think these health effects and others are important. And one thing that we are exploring now is to do some pretty ambitious work connecting benefits access and higher education, and what's the impact of benefits access can have on college student success, stability, and completion. And potentially, if you think of that as with the student, but then also the family, and some choices that students often have, or college-ready folks have to make if their families are in more insecure economic conditions in terms of whether they go to school or which programs they pursue. It'd be really interesting to find out if the family is not that the benefit system is making someone completely stable, but at least more secure, where maybe the student feels comfortable going to that more competitive university across the country, and frankly pursuing the kind of degrees that everyone here has that can utterly transform a family's generational economic trajectory.
Absolutely. I mean, I see that with a lot of students, right? They have two options, one more secure than other, but the more secure one is actually in the less good school, and they choose that one just for security. So absolutely. I think there's a follow-up question from Anna that I think is for Ellora's point on the heterogeneity in intergenerational mobility. So I think she's wondering what exactly are the heterogeneity in intergenerational mobility between different incomes level, or even the variance within an income bracket.
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. So what we've found, and what other researchers have found with kind of incredible data coming from the IRS, so using American tax records, you can really get a very precise measure of the relationship between parent income and kids' adult income. And if you were to plot, on the y-axis, kids' income once they're adults, and on that x-axis, parent income, you actually see pretty much a straight line. And so what that's saying is that there's really, truly, a certain amount you get for every dollar of parent income, and that's a very linear relationship. What is another interesting statistic is the slope of that line. So when we talk about intergenerational mobility, a very steep line is saying that, basically you're born, your parents' income is going to determine where you end up. A flatter line is a more mobile society, right? So you're not necessarily locked into the bottom or the top. But this also kind of has some, perverse consequences. So for example, if you were to look at racial gaps in these two, in this line, the upward mobility line for Black Americans is flatter, because you're much more likely to fall from the top than you are if you're a white American, for example. So that's kind of this sort of bittersweet, I guess, fact about when we think about upward mobility differences by race.
Okay, so we have 4 minutes, and there is one more question from the audience, and then I also want to close with another question. So maybe I'll just wrap the two together. So Lauren Chambers asked, just thank you for both for such fantastic discussion, +1 for me. I'm wondering whether this discussion of Black-white disparities might be able to say, what is able to say about racial differences beyond this binary, for example, for other population that next Asians. So that's one question from Lauren, and I'm going to, just in case we run out of time, add my last question, which is, I want to end at the fact that there is more movements that are moving to change the balance of power. And there's a lot of this is happening outside of academia. So what can we in academia do to be supportive or to be part of those movements? Thank you.
I can quickly just give some thoughts on those two things before passing it on to Trooper. So one, we absolutely, at least within the field of economics, need a big investment in studying these other types of gaps. There's some work, but there should be a lot more. Even the Black-white gap is something that's only recently kind of taking off in the field of economics. Of course, there's a long literature, but by a very small number of people. But what we do know, if you look at, for example, and I teach, the economic history of the US is one of land expropriation from indigenous communities. Well, that's going to translate, very clearly, right, into these wealth differences. And we see things like eminent domain used against, non-white groups, Latinx groups as well. So all of these things are going to generate wealth differences, and indeed wealth gaps between Latinx, indigenous, and white populations look very similar, very large, similar to the Black-white gap. With Asian Americans, there's a whole interesting field of study that's just trying to understand, why do we pool so many different groups with such different experiences in this umbrella category? And there is a lot of heterogeneity in that experience as well as heterogeneity by whether or not your parents were born in the US or if they immigrated to the US. So there's a lot of interesting work there. And then just very quickly, I just wanted to make a statement about, clearly activism pushes policy, right? And so then we can actually learn. So it's what Trooper was saying earlier, stories move, and movements can create those narratives that move policy. And then we can kind of say, oh, well, maybe we didn't have all the data, but now we have the policy change and we can understand. So I think there's always a role you can play, maybe separate from your academic role, in terms of, where you think policy should go. And that's your role as a human being engaged in society. And it's a really important one.
Absolutely. I think the question from Black-white disparity, but how does it relate to other communities? In our work, it's something that, frankly, we have to make sure we are constantly holding our feet to the fire around, and making sure that as we are advancing equity, that we are making sure that we are being as expansive as possible and recognizing where some of our blind spots or knowledge gaps can be, because you're correct. We could have the best information on Black-white disparities or Black Latinx white disparities. And if we have not fully done our job, if we have not considered indigenous, we have not considered Asian American Pacific Islanders. So that is absolutely correct. I think in terms of the role, I think one is being your authentic selves and doing what you do really, really well. But then I think building those relationships, maybe go across to the next building and head over to the sociology department and find the folks who are, tearing their hair out, trying to write their manuscripts and build some alliances in that conversation. I'd also say that, people who are more involved in the sort of outside advocacy policy world, sometimes you're just kind of running on fumes with a few good talking points and a few stories, and you are desperate for some protein, some muscle. And so, like, as I mentioned earlier today, Tim Neat and Joy's paper from a few years ago, why it's just been so extraordinary is that it gave people who've been arguing about some of these things some great rigor. And then two, I love the point about sometimes step outside of academia and just being engaged as a person in things, but don't underestimate even just the way you approach problems and how you think and the questions you ask and the scrutiny that you give. When it's blended with folks who may bring other perspectives and disciplines, it can be really powerful.
Thank you so much.
Can I just say one other thing?
Okay.
I'm sorry, can I just say one other thing? The one cautionary point I would say, and I mentioned in my talk earlier, that folks who are involved in data and machine learning and you're the cool kids, right now. It may not feel like it sometimes when you're just doing your work, but you're the cool kids. And it can be intimidating for folks who may come from more of a qualitative background and who may have run scared from anything with a number, since they were in grade school. Folks might be intimidated even having a conversation with you. And so I think part of that building that bridge is sort of figuring out how to pull people in and create a sense of comfort. And I would say that to other guilds as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ellora and Trooper. That was really, really enlightening conversation. I enjoyed it very much. I am going to, in the interest of time, turn this over to the chair of our final remarks.
Thank you so much, Sera. And thank you, Ellora and Trooper, for that excellent discussion. I wish we had an extra hour or something to just keep it going. And especially what you said about some of these aspects of our work that we tend to ignore, the historical aspects, the psychological aspects, the logistical aspects, all that stuff really resonated with me. And also what you mentioned, I mean, the thing that I find most inspiring about this community is that many of us are researchers, but everyone I talk to here understands the importance of understanding our role in a broader context, understanding our role and responsibility as people who are not just researchers, but also community members, right, and friends and neighbors to people who may be struggling and acting in that way. And so I really appreciate you ending on that very important note, and for all your wonderful work.